Hey, how you guys doing? It's the producer from Brothers Comics. Welcome to the Who Day Over 40 podcast for long-time, long-suffering Cincinnati Bengals fans. Who Day, everybody. All right, so we're continuing our series and counting down to opening kickoff against the Patriots. Again, shout out if you listen to this show or watch the show. I will be at the home game, me and the Goat Killer, against the Patriots that day. So, look at this face, remember it, and, holler at me if you see me at the game or at the tailgate. All right. So we're going 86 days now. Last show was 87 days. In case you thought I pre-recorded these ahead of time, T. Higgins signs his franchise tender today. That's very exciting to me, and we'll talk about this with a different podcast with Hutch coming up. This actually thinks me there's a potential for a long-term extension here, even though everybody's been saying that it wasn't going to happen. But him signing before camp even started is probably a really good sign that there's at least the potential of that happening. So, all right. So 86 days, just like we did with the last show, I'm going to be counting down chronologically from the years about players that have worn the number 86 for the Cincinnati Bengals. I was going to break them up into different categories because some of these guys are just literally unknowns. Some of them are Jags, just another guy. And then there's been some good players here. 86 is going to be a little bit different than 87 because 87 at least had some recognizable names that did something. 86 has been kind of a dark hole, to be honest with you. There's really only one player that has worn the number 86 for the Bengals that really had I would call a very good career for the Cincinnati Bengals. There's one other player that had, a pretty decent career, but the rest of it at 86, straight garbage and trash that players that have worn that, starting from what you're going to see here coming up from the late 60s. And then we go all the way through the last person to wear number 86, which was Devin Asiasi, and he was trash too. All right, so here we go. Not a lot of good dudes here for 86. All right, let's start it off. First 286, not that great. Andre White, 1968. He's undrafted out of FAMU, played 3 games for the Bengals and had 2 catches for 18 yards. Not a whole lot. John McDaniel from 74 to 77. So there's a big break in between people wearing number 86. 8th round pick out of the Bengals out of Lincoln College. Lincoln College is an HBCU in Lincoln, in Missouri. 4 seasons with the Bengals. He had 26 catches for, I don't know, it was like 400 yards or something like that over the course of 4 seasons. Again, you have to remember though, the tight end position has evolved over time, and especially at this particular time, and even kind of later on with the Bengals here, like, some of these guys were drafted just to do special teams. I'm going to be the wide receiver or it's going to be the tight end, but it's just going to be on blocking downs. It really wasn't something that evolved into this pass catching thing. And you still see a little bit of that with the Bengals right now. We have, a primary blocking tight end, and then now we have Mike Gesicki. He's, going to be a receiving tight end. But yeah, just early on, not a lot of great 86s to start here with the Cincinnati Bengals. Next up, though, Steve Kreider. Now, I'm going to say this, and I mean this with every bit of my heart. From 87, with Pat McInally being the punter / wide receiver, and now Steve Kreider here in like 79, this definitely started my love of white wide receivers for the Bengals. So McInally was actually one of my dudes and one of my favorite players. Of course, I loved Isaac Curtis and all of that, but McInally was one of my favorite players. And then in 80, when the Bengals draft Chris Collinsworth, he was my favorite player, and then Steve Kreider, I remember from this time too, Again, it's all the typical white wide receiver things, gritty, grinder, first in the gym, last one to leave, makes the tough catches, good character guy. Like all of those things fit for Steve Kreider. He was a really good player, 6th round pick out of Lehigh. And so much like Pat McInally coming out of Harvard, the Bengals drafting a late round pick out of for a player who obviously has the smarts, not just in football, but for other things. Plays that wide receiver position, 150 catches for almost 2,000 yards. And again, in a league that was evolving around the pass at that particular point, he had a fairly decent career for the Bengals. Like I said, he was actually one of my favorite players, and he was on the 81 Super Bowl team as well. Again, just a good player, and a decent number 86. And he would be the top 86 if it wasn't for the player that we're going to be talking about here momentarily. Steve Kreider would definitely be it, but he's not one. He's 2, but number 1 has a really good career, and it's hard to touch that. All right. So we go through a couple of people that are just straight garbage. Ken Brown, 1987, nothing. Carl Parker, a 12th round pick, nothing. Between the two of them, they had 3 total catches. 3 catches in 3 seasons. Again, blocking tight ends or wide receivers who I couldn't actually catch. And again, the draft was so long back then, you were drafting people that had probably no business being in the NFL, but man, you got to do a little bit better than that. 3 catches between 2 dudes in 3 seasons. That's not very good at all. But, that's where we are. You're going to get that over the course of time for the Cincinnati Bengals. All right. 1990 to 1991, Michael Barber. Tight end, drafted out of the 4th round out of Marshall by the 49ers, and he spends 2 seasons with the Bengals, and he has 37 catches for 459 yards. I have no idea who this dude is, and he would have played at a time where I'm old enough to know who the Bengals are, but we are dipping into the lost decade here. He is a white tight end wide receiver, so he should have been in my wheelhouse, but I actually have never heard of Michael Barber before. He had a couple of decent seasons. That's okay. Not really that bad, but yeah. Anybody ever heard of Michael Barber before? Played that season with the Bengals? Because it wasn't me. All right, 1993, Wesley Carroll, 2nd round pick by the Saints. Obviously, he busted out there. Bengals thought they could fix him. They didn't. 1 season, straight trash, nothing to report on for Wesley Carroll. And it's so funny, like being a fan of this team, and I guess of any other team that you have, like over the course of time, your team's going to have some bust out there completely. But you kind of forget sometimes that other teams don't have this draft shit figured out perfectly either, and they waste 2nd round picks on the likes of Wesley Carroll. This is going to come up here in a bit here for a not a poverty franchise, but one of the elite franchises, at least in the league at a certain point. But yeah, no Wesley Carroll stats, no Wesley Carroll football card, just straight up garbage for Wesley Carroll in 1993. All right, so here's the number 186, y'all. It's Darnay Scott, 2nd round pick out of San Diego State. A great number 2 wide receiver opposite of Carl Pickens and the Jeff Blake, moonball years that he is really going to come in and do so well for the Bengals. Even as a rookie, he comes in and plays pretty well. 7 seasons with the Bengals, under 400 catches and just under 6,000 yards. Like, that's a solid career for a number 2 wide receiver. He has 1,000-yard season on 68 catches in 1999. Like, Darnay Scott was a very good player. He was just drafted onto the Bengals at a time where the quarterback situation was completely in flux. And as much as everybody loves Jeff Blake's deep ball, remember, it's all that he had. He really didn't have much else after that. And then around him, too, the team wasn't very good either. The coaching wasn't very good. The ownership wasn't very good. Like, it's just wasn't a good team. So much kind of like Corey Dillon in a sense, this pretty, Corey Dillon, a Hall of Fame type player, but Darnay Scott and Carl Pickens, even for that matter, too, are pretty good players. But because they played in that lost decade, man, it just gets swept under. But if you were watching the Bengals at the time, you knew Darnay Scott was a really good player. You knew Pick was a good player as well. But, man, just because the team had so little success during that time, it really gets washed under. But, yeah, Darnay Scott, a very good player, and by far the best player to wear 86 for the Bengals. All right, Tony Stewart, drafted by the Bengals, plays 5 seasons for the Bengals in the Marvin Lewis era. Okay, so he was actually a free agent signing by the Bengals where they bring him in. And, again, Marvin era, he's not really looking at, especially in that early era, he wasn't looking for tight ends to catch the ball. He was looking for people that could block. And that was Tony Stewart, more blocker than pass catcher. And he was solid in that regard. I mean, again, over 5 seasons, he has 50 catches for 412 yards. That's not great, okay? 10 catches a year for what, 80 yards a year? I mean, that's just not great at all. My biggest memory of him is in the last game of Marvin's first season in 2003, 2004. The Bengals are playing the Browns in Cincinnati. And the reason I remember that is because I'm actually at this game. And I can't remember the wide receiver, but the Bengals allowed, but he ran for like 200 yards against the Bengals defense that day in Cincinnati. And the Bengals had a shot to go down and either tie or win the game. And, Kitten is the quarterback, and his last pass is to Tony Stewart, who had his hands on the ball. It was a little high, don't get me wrong, If he had caught that, they could have continued to drive and maybe gone on to win or tie the game, but he whiffed it completely. And that's my biggest memory of Tony Stewart. But yeah, I mean, he was an okay average. He was the epitome of a Marvin guy. And you're going to see over the next couple of these Marvin guys. And Tony Stewart was definitely one. Daniel Coates comes out after that too, undrafted by the Bengals out of BYU, a total Marvin guy too. He comes in, brings his lunch pail, wouldn't say, anything with a mouthful of sand. Like, he was just like one of those dudes for the Bengals. He has 30 catches for the Bengals for 291 yards out on 3 seasons. Again, these are not great receiving numbers. And that's really not what they wanted. I've been watching some of the older games though on YouTube, and he does make some catches here and there, like in the Carson Palmer era. But like, he was not here to be catching passes. He was really just there to block, and block is what he did. But yeah, just another Marvin guy. But a very kind of jaggy 86. All right, Donald Lee. Like, wait a second, Donald Lee played for the Bengals, the dude that won like a championship with the Packers? Yes, he did. Barely. Drafted by the Dolphins, but he made a huge name for himself in Green Bay as one of the better tight ends in the league under Brett Favre. And under Brett Favre and under Aaron Rodgers or whatever. Like, he had a career there, like a very good career. But then once he fell out of favor there and he got a little bit old, and his age 31 season, he winds up with the Bengals. He winds up getting hurt for a little bit, and then he misses a bunch of time. He caught 11 total passes. I mean, his best days were way behind him, and then he's pretty much out of the league. And that leads me to something, too, that you used to see with the Bengals, too, where when they weren't very good in the late 90s and early 2000s, too, is that dudes would be signing with the Bengals in free agency as the last stop, saloon. Like the Gary Reasons of the world, like dudes that would sign on with the Bengals, like, because to get that last paycheck, because they had no other options. And the Bengals were looking to sign a name over an actual player because the best days of that particular player were behind them. They would sign these dudes. They wouldn't do very well. AJ Hawk is another name, one of those two. Like, it's just a guy. And Donald Lee was that too. He had no other options. He signed with the Bengals, and his best days were clearly behind him at that particular point. All right. And then nobody touches 86 again until 2014. 2014, you get Mason Schreck and James Wright. James Wright, the wide receiver out of LSU in the 7th round. Mason Schreck, a tight end. What is he? I can't remember what college that he went to, but it wasn't a big one. And not great between the two of them. Nothing. They're just bad. Like, I think he had 18 catches for 197 yards in 3 seasons for James Wright. And people thought James Wright was actually going to be good. He fell to the 7th round. Remember, the Bengals love to pick up trash that they think is going to work. Back in that day, it didn't work out. Mason Schreck, the tight end, he comes in. He's 2 catches for 6 yards his total career. Again, more of a blocking guy. Marvin loves those blocking tight ends. He didn't really want them to catch. And and he really wasn't that great at a blocker either. But yeah, just absolute trash, by the Bengals between those 2 years and these two dudes. The last person to wear 86, y'all, and it is not claimed up or being claimed right now by players, Devin Asiasi. I remember I mentioned that, like, yeah, man, some really quality franchises be having some draft day busts too. The Patriots drafted Devin Asiasi in the 3rd round out of the school up north. He had 2 seasons with the Patriots, and he was cut. And the Bengals picked him up off the waiver wire and signed him, to their team. And, he's on the team for the Super Bowl run, but he wasn't very good. He was signed primarily to be a blocker. Didn't really do much of that. Catch some passes. Didn't really do much of that either. He only plays for the 1 season, 2 catches for 5 yards. That's it. That's his whole receiving career for the Bengals. And then, like, oh, well, maybe it just wasn't a good fit there. Yeah, he's not even in the league at this point. So the Patriots, quality A-plus franchise, drafted Devin Asiasi in the 3rd round. It didn't work out for them. It didn't work out for the Bengals, and that's the end of our 86. So there you go. 85 is going to be great, though, y'all, because off the top of your head, there are 2 solid 85s, and Isaac Curtis and obviously Chad Johnson. And then you have Tyler Eifert as well. And then you have T. Higgins, the recently signed franchise tag player, those are some pretty good 85s. And the Bengals have actually been pretty good about making sure that 85 didn't wind up on some scrubs, although it does. But people that have gotten that 85 have generally stayed, played a few seasons, and other people didn't want to pick up the mantle really until T picked it back up here, a few years ago. And even he was like, I don't really want to make a name for myself because everybody's going to think of Chad when they see 85. So we'll be back to 85 days to kickoff right there. Talk a little about maybe even actually rank, those 85s in the order that we think that that were most successful. And we'll be back. We're almost ready to kick off, y'all. 85 days. Peace, everybody. Good night.